Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Kris. This is Lincoln's Final Homecoming, the unbelievable journey of the president's body. It's been pretty good so far. A lot of stuff I didn't realize. I guess you pass over some of the details. You just don't think about it. But you give me that thumbs up. Click on that subscribe. That helps me out. It's a good channel, Grave Explorations. I don't know if they've done anything current, unfortunately. But you can donate to the channel through the thanks button. Request a video. Your name sponsors the video. Still request without. It just takes a little more time. Okay? Let's get into part 2.
Lincoln had many connections in the city of Chicago going back to his days as a circuit lawyer. It was here that many of his most famous cases had been tried, and it was where in 1860 Lincoln became the Republican nominee for President of the United States. With so much shared history, the city vowed that its reception would far exceed New York. The funeral procession made its way along streets that were overflowing. Windows and rooftops of every building were also filled with somber faces. He was brought to the Cook County Courthouse, where his coffin would again be opened so that mourners might look upon his face. The light in the viewing chamber was kept dim to make the ravages of death less evident, but people could still plainly see the dark discoloration under Lincoln's right eye where Booth's infernal missile had lodged. At 8 p.m. on May 2nd, the coffin was closed and by torchlight was borne by 8 horses to the train depot, where it would begin the final leg of its journey. When the funeral train left Chicago, 11 days had passed since it began its journey. It traveled 1,600 miles, crossing 7 states and hundreds of towns, both big and small. Now it crossed into the rolling prairie beneath a broad open sky. It was the land that Lincoln knew best and felt the most at home. Along the tracks, bonfires lighted the way, and thousands waited and watched throughout the night to see one of their own borne to his rest. When the train came into view in the gray light of dawn, farmers plowing their fields stopped and removed their hats until it was out of sight. Young children who knew little about Lincoln would remember the moment long into their lives as the first time they saw their parents weep. It was how most of this new generation would come to understand just how much Abraham Lincoln meant. In Springfield on May 3rd, the funeral train arrived at the Chicago and Alton Depot. The windows of the station were hung with black curtains and streamers. For those who were there, it conjured memories of February 1861, when Lincoln bade an emotional goodbye to his friends and neighbors, to whom he said he owed everything. On April 14th, news of Lincoln's assassination reached Springfield by telegraph about an hour after it happened. From that moment, the city Lincoln called home entered a period of deep mourning. There were hardly any buildings or public squares that weren't decorated in black. And there was an overnight interest in visiting the places that Lincoln had frequented. Visitors went to his old law office, seen here festooned with a banner stating that he lives in the hearts of the people. In this photo, a collection of top-hatted men pose in front of the Globe Tavern on Adams Street, where Abraham and Mary lived after they were married and where their son Robert was born. But the one location that everyone went to see was the frame house on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets that had been Lincoln's home from 1844 to 1861. It was the only home he ever owned, and it was where 3 of his 4 children were born and where 1 died. In 1860, a large rally was held there so Republican delegates could meet their presidential candidate.
I believe they say that's him right there with his hat off. Won't you let me in? Is that Kansas? Won't you let me in, Kansas?
Held there so Republican delegates could meet their presidential candidate. And now, 5 years later, it was the site of similar gatherings, and in the days leading up to the funeral, the number of mourning decorations increased until the house was nearly covered. With the influx of so many tourists came the demand for souvenirs. Peddlers sold pictures of the slain president and his family, and for those who wanted a more intimate look into their private lives, they had images of his house, both outside and inside, which included views of the front parlor and the room he and Mary had slept in. Photos of the Lincoln animals were also popular. They included his horse Old Bob and his dog Fido. Priced at 10 cents apiece for the carte de visite size and a quarter for the larger cabinet cards, they sold as fast as they could be produced. Photographers took stereo images of the cortege as it marched to the state capitol. The venerable building stood across the street from Lincoln's old law office and had been his second home. His presence in its chambers and halls was as familiar as the yellow limestone that made up its facade. In 1858, he had given one of his most important speeches here about the evils of slavery. He wrote the speech in the state library, seated at a desk like these. It was delivered at the Republican State Convention. At the time, he was running for the United States Senate against incumbent Stephen A. Douglas. Borrowing from the Bible, he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." He said those words here in the Hall of Representatives, standing beneath this portrait of George Washington. Now on May 3, 1865, the same place was prepared for him once more, only the speaker's podium was replaced with a catafalque. It was a surreal scene outside as people silently and orderly moved through the gate and up the steps of the Capitol. They came throughout the night and into the next morning. It was estimated that in all, over 75,000 people passed through this room. Along the front of the gallery appeared a quote from a speech Lincoln made in 1861 about the freedom that was promised for all within the Declaration of Independence. He said, "Sooner than surrender these principles, I would rather be assassinated on this spot." Many Springfieldians had known him personally and could still recall the infinite supply of humorous stories he told that were always apropos for the occasion. Many others knew him by reputation only, but could still recall the brief exchanges of greeting they shared with him on the street. When they heard the news he had been killed, it came like a thunderbolt, and they could hardly believe that it was so. Now, as they filed past his coffin, they could finally see for themselves that it was true. In 1861, the process of arterial embalming was a new science that gained in popularity in the United States during the Civil War. It made it possible for families to preserve the remains of their loved ones fallen in battle until they could be shipped home for burial. Lincoln was introduced to the process when his close friend and law student, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, was killed on May 24, 1861. He died while removing a Confederate flag from a building in Alexandria, Virginia, becoming the first Union officer to die in the Civil War. After his body was...
Okay, I gotta go back. Picking up a dog and the other one just jumps up right on me. All right.
Ellsworth was killed on May 24th, close shipped home for burial. Lincoln was introduced to the process when his close friend and law student, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, was killed on May 24, 1861. He died while removing a Confederate flag from a building in Alexandria, Virginia, becoming the first Union officer to die in the Civil War. After his body was embalmed, it lay in state in the East Room of the White House. Mary Lincoln remarked that the young man appeared to be in peaceful slumber rather than in the cold embrace of death. The Lincolns remembered the miracle process a mere 9 months later when their beloved son Willie succumbed to typhoid fever at age 11. The weight of the parents' bereavement was profound. Mary was nearly catatonic and secluded herself in her room where she claimed that Willie's ghost paid nightly visits. Lincoln was also overcome with grief and given to bouts of uncontrollable sobbing. It was said that on at least 2 separate occasions he went to the mausoleum at Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown and had his son's casket opened so that he might gaze upon his face. The preservation of Willie's body was a testament to the embalmer's artistry. President Lincoln's state funeral was the longest and most elaborate the country would ever see. The 1,600-mile, 20-day journey put the science of embalming to the ultimate test. At the time, the chemicals used in preserving remains included arsenic, creosote, mercury, and turpentine, among others. Formaldehyde would not be commercially produced until the 1880s. Among the hundreds of dignitaries on board the funeral train was Dr. Charles D. Brown, Lincoln's embalmer, who had the task of readying the fallen leader for the multiple viewings along the way. The president seemed to hold up well on the first leg. However, on April 25th, the New York Times reported the following.
To those who had not seen Mr. Lincoln in life, the view may be satisfactory, but to those who were familiar with his features, it is far otherwise. The color is leaden, almost brown. The forehead recedes sharp and clearly marked. The eyes deep sunk and close held upon the sockets. The cheekbones, always high, are unusually prominent. The cheeks hollowed and deep-pitted. The unnaturally thin lips shut tight and firm, as if glued together, and the small chin, covered with slight beard, seemed pointed and sharp. The body is dressed in black. The white turned-over collar and the clean white gloves make a strong contrast to the black velvet cloth and leaden-hued features. This is all that remains of the man whom goodness made great, and whose rest in the hearts of the people is forever and abiding. It will not be possible, despite the affection of the embalming, to continue much longer the exhibition, as the constant shaking of the body, aided by the exposure to the air and the increasing of dust, has already undone much of the embalmer's workmanship, and it is doubtful if it will be decreed wise to tempt dissolution much further.
A week later, when the funeral train reached Springfield, the coffin was placed in the State House, and when it was opened, Dr. Brown was shocked by what he saw. To his utter distress, he discovered that Lincoln's face had turned completely black. As the public clamored to be admitted into the viewing chamber, the doctor knew there was no chance they would be allowed to see the body in such a dreadful state, and furthermore, he had no idea what to do about it. Local undertaker Thomas Lynch offered to assist. He wrote the following account of what happened next.
I called at a neighboring drugstore and procured a rouge chalk and amber, with such brushes as I needed, and returned to the room. I at once set about coloring the president's features, placing the materials on very thick so as to completely hide the discoloration of the skin. In half an hour I had finished my task, and the doors were thrown open to the public.
However, Lynch's best efforts could not mask all the ravages of decomposition. In her book 20 Days, Dorothy Meserve Cunhart wrote that hardly anyone shed tears while making the trip past the coffin. They were too shocked by what they saw. But outside on the streets, they broke down and wept. Everyone asked everyone else what he had thought of the remains, and most people felt they had a duty to Lincoln's memory to lie. They said for the most part he looked peaceful and as if merely asleep. Children especially would forever remember the sight, or hear their friends tell of it and remember it in that way. And many of them that evening went to their rooms alone and made entries in their diaries like this one of a young Springfield girl named Anna Ridgely.
Crowds of people went to see it. Men, women, and children gazed upon the decaying corpse. I am thankful I did not go, for I know the image would have remained in my mind. My sister Janie went with the Philharmonic Society to sing and sat where she could not help but look upon the body for an hour. The air was scented with evergreen, which was placed all around the room, and the poor child came near fainting. She was so nervous when she came home, I feared she would not sleep.
After the last mourner had passed through the Hall of Representatives, Lincoln's coffin was closed and moved to a waiting hearse. The hearse was a magnificent vehicle loaned to the city of Springfield by the mayor of St. Louis. Richly appointed with silver and gold and topped with ostrich feather plumes, it carried the president's coffin to Oak Ridge Cemetery in the last and most somber of all the processions. When it arrived at the cemetery, the crowds were so thick that there was hardly a patch of open ground. People stood in the sun, weeping softly through each oration and musical presentation until the final prayer was delivered. Then his coffin was placed in the receiving vault and locked behind thick iron doors. He had been dead for 20 days, and now Abraham Lincoln truly did belong to the ages. Abraham Lincoln's story did not end with his death. In Part 2, we will see the country grapple with how to honor and preserve his memory. As plans to build his tomb commenced, a dispute between his widow and the city of Springfield almost resulted in him being laid to rest outside of his adopted home.
The people are in a rage, and all the hard stories that were ever told about her are told over again. She has no friends here.
Years behind schedule, the dedication ceremony went ahead, but what the distinguished guests did not know was that construction was still going on, and that the very ground they were standing on would one day threaten the tomb's future. When it was done, it was intended to be a place where the public could come and pay respects to their fallen hero, and where he would rest forever in peace. However, time, the elements, and an unthinkable human threat put his sacred remains and a nation's honor in peril. We will see Lincoln reborn as a national savior, and how the shadow of this new image fell upon the family he left behind. Finally, through the eyes of a young man, we will lift the veil and gaze once more upon the face of Lincoln. Come walk with me as the story continues in the next Grave Explorations.
I did that video first before I saw this one, so this will go up first. All right. We're going to end it here. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. I thought it was pretty good. When I said he was embalmed, he was the first. I meant the first president to be embalmed. And when they said I had heard he'd look like a mummy, that makes sense when the guy got all the chalk and painted everything. But clearly, it didn't work as well because formaldehyde worked better. But still, you got to test things out here and there. Well, we're going to end it here. I'm going to go eat some dinner. So I hope you enjoyed. Until next time, have a good day. Have a good night.